Thanks everyone for coming. I am Jack Cable. I'm going to be talking about some of the policy actions that have happened over the past couple of years to secure the open source ecosystem, and both recap some of the past actions as well as look into the future. And I think should be complementary with our previous panel here. I'll be mostly focused in the US, just since that's where I've primarily worked on, but clearly a lot else happening in Europe or elsewhere that should be on people's radars as well. Awesome. Let's dive in. So start just with some intros on myself. So I'm currently the co-founder and CEO of a company called Corridor. We're working to secure AI coding. Before this, I was a senior technical advisor at CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and helped lead a lot of the open source initiatives along with many others, built out a bunch of that work, as well as the Secure by Design initiative. Come from background in security research and software development, got into security through bug bounty programs, and also relevant to this talk, spent a year on the Hill in the Senate working on cybersecurity policy, including open source software security. And this was right after Log4j, so as you can imagine, there was a lot of interest in open source software and tried to steer that into a positive direction instead of many other kind of possible ways that could head. So I'm going to cover a lot of the open source policy landscape and sum up some of the recent actions, many of which I've been involved with, and then kind of see what the future might hold. So going to start with a kind of core framing question, right? What is the government's role in helping secure the open source ecosystem? What should it be? Historically, right, there hasn't been a ton of involvement. Certainly, if you go back to the very start of the internet, right, government was core to a lot of that. But over the years, I think it's safe to say that, except in some small pockets, that action trailed off, right? Government was no longer the leader in the space, instead trying to catch up. But the reality is still that the government is the largest user, I think it's safe to say, of open source software in the world, right? That they're also, given that this is a public good, in my opinion, there's a logical role, right, for the government to not try to control or regulate the open source ecosystem, but to show up and do the work to, in this case, secure the ecosystem. So that's really kind of how I took inspiration for a lot of the work here. Going back in time a bit, I think one of the kind of first interesting policy actions around open source software was back in 2016 with the federal source code policy. And what this was to essentially help federal agencies better manage their source code, and included provisions both around sharing source code across agencies, but then also it includes some provisions around making sure that a certain portion of their software is made open source. So I'll start with that and then get into a bunch of the other policy actions that have occurred. So the federal source code policy is an interesting thing, especially now, almost a decade later, to look back upon, right? I think a lot of the right kind of ideas were there. There was a pilot that instructed to have federal agencies open source 20% of their code. What does 20% of your code mean? No one really knows, but the gist of it, right, was that agencies should try to open source more of their code. And a lot did happen. I believe it's still up. Code.gov is the kind of website that coalesced a lot of federal agency source code. A number of agencies did begin publishing a lot of open source code, including GSA, and as well as Department of Defense and others. So I think this was a really positive action, but in any sense, the kind of spirit and push for open source trailed off a bit afterwards, and over time that there was less and less of a focus. I think. And many of this, right, was inspired by Heartbleed, which happened, and was sort of a wake-up call to those in DC that, hey, open source software is important, we should do things about it, led to some actions. And then over the coming years, people started to forget about it. But Log4j was another interesting event, right? Again, for DC policymakers, because it reminded them that, hey, like open source software is real and can have real consequences, and maybe we should think about it. That's when I came in. And if you aren't familiar, there's this really great program called Tech Congress. I did it in 2022. It essentially takes people with technology backgrounds, and you go and work in Congress for a year. So I did this, was working for the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, which has jurisdiction both around cybersecurity, including CISA, but also generally the government's use of technology. And this was right after Log4j, right? And as you can imagine, when something like this happens, policymakers rush to, sometimes policies that maybe those of us in this room wouldn't think are the most forward-looking. At one point, Tech Congress did a study across kind of all of the tens of thousands of Hill staffers and found that fewer than 20 of them had any sort of background in computer science or software development. So there really is, right, a lack of this sort of knowledge in policy circles. That's improved over recent years thanks to programs like Tech Congress, but we're still in a state, right, where the average Hill staffer, maybe they have a political science degree, they work their way up on the Hill for a couple of years, and then get assigned a topic like technology or cybersecurity and have to kind of learn about that space, right? And especially when it comes to the intricacies of open source software, those dynamics might not be super familiar to someone who hasn't immersed themselves in that. So really why we need people with technical backgrounds, right, in places that are making these sorts of policy decisions. I think we saw a productive example, right, with the Cyber Resilience Act, for instance, where initially the kind of requirements around open source software were quite strict and received a lot of pushback from the open source community. And thankfully, the staffers there did kind of understand those concerns, respond to it, and the end result was something that I think most people were happy with. So that was in part what led to some of the work I did while on the Hill. Wrote this bill called the Securing Open Source Software Act that really focused on seeing how the government could offer help to the open source community, right? As you can imagine, there were all sorts of proposals. One thing government, people like to propose is things like requiring identity verification for open source developers, right? This in the camp of bad ideas. They're like, well, we can't be using open source software that's written by people from our adversaries like Russia or China, and they're like, we should just make sure that we know everyone who's contributing to open source code. Practically, we know, right, if you do that, then that probably excludes all the open source software in the world, since it's a global community. But that is, one of the viewpoints that often gets brought up, and often, working in these places, you'll have to push back on those sorts of proposals. So I was trying to steer this towards something that wasn't going to, break open source as we know it, to do something a little more productive. And what the bill does is a couple things. One, it would really make a core focus of CISA to be focused on helping secure the open source ecosystem, right? And for those who aren't familiar, CISA is the primary civilian agency tasked with defending the federal government as well as critical infrastructure. So their goal is to defend both government as well as the much broader ecosystem. And in my opinion, open source, right, is a core part of that. It is the foundation of much of the technology that our critical infrastructure relies upon. So it would make sense for CISA to be tasked with protecting that. So that was some of what the bill laid out. As well as the other main focus was to really understand the federal government's existing use of open source software. Part of that would be to have the Office of Management and Budget in the White House to put out guidance to federal agencies around managing risks of open source software. There's language there as well around piloting open source program offices at federal agencies, right? Much as private companies have started to do. Government really could benefit from having people who are managing not just their agency's use of open source software, but also, in line with the federal source code policy, how they're publishing open source software to the world. There was a lot of, I think good stuff in this bill. Unfortunately, it hasn't become law yet, at least. There's been a lot of bipartisan support around it, but as you know, Congress hasn't really been in the business of passing laws lately. So maybe one day this will become law. But regardless, we were able to implement a lot of what was in here. Right when I left Congress, went to work at CISA and did a bunch of this. Hired a lot of people like Ava Black, Tim Pepper, focused on open source software security, started to build out a lot of these initiatives. Now, unfortunately, right, I have to acknowledge that over the past year, there's been a lot of this work that has been undone. Most of the people who were at CISA focused on open source software are no longer there. Due to layoffs and budget cuts. So the future of this, at least in the near term, is somewhat unclear. So I do want to make that clear, right, that I do hope that a lot of the good work that's been done isn't for nothing. So that was the work that happened in the Senate. Had some other fun stuff. You might have seen headlines around the White House and Rust, memory safety, right? This was one of the provisions that I worked on that got into one of the appropriations bills around making sure that, the government is evaluating its memory safety, so it instructed the White House Office of the National Cyber Director to put out a report into memory safety, which, so this was law. They did put out that report, right? And I think we did successfully elevate memory safety to be something that policymakers were talking about, right? Rather than a kind of niche technical topic, recognizing that, if you look at a piece of software written in a memory unsafe language, about 2/3 of all vulnerabilities in that are memory safety vulnerabilities. So really important area, and I think helped kick off some of the programs like DARPA's Tractor, looking at translating all C into Rust, a really ambitious project, but it's great to have some funding around that and a bunch of companies working on that. And that still is ongoing, so excited to see some of the results associated with that. So that's some of the congressional actions. I want to dive into some of what happened in the executive branch, right? So there's the National Cybersecurity Strategy in the US, and really this called for rebalancing responsibility to put the burden away from those least capable of securing themselves, right? Individuals, small businesses, school systems, name it, onto those who are most capable bearing it, namely, the technology manufacturers who are building the products that underpin our critical infrastructure. And really kind of a part of this was looking at open source software, right? And this was something that we were pushing at CISA, was around making sure that, in line with the Secure by Design initiative, that tech companies were taking on more responsibility for the open source software that they got so much value from, right? So really the more they can do to contribute back to help make sure the ecosystem is secure, right? Many of the projects being discussed today, I think are core elements of how we can make sure that this ecosystem is sustainable. And there were a number of kind of actions that spun off around this. Right at CISA, we had our Secure by Design white paper, which was looking at both closed and open source software, really seeing how tech companies could reduce the rate of vulnerabilities introduced in their products by taking actions like using memory safe languages or other systemic preventions to entire classes of vulnerabilities. We also put out the open source software security roadmap at CISA. and this had a number of core elements, including one further integrating CISA into open source communities, right? So I'll dive into some of this, but we got involved with OpenSF and other community groups in order to do things like kind of standardizing security for open source package repositories. We also worked to catalog, understand the federal government's own use of open source software and take actions to improve that, as well as to secure the broader open source ecosystem. So, we did some fun things like hosting a summit with many people from the open source community. So we held this event really focused on securing package repositories, taking other actions to strengthen the security of open source. And part of this, too, was establishing communications channels, right, to help coordinate incident response. We did a tabletop exercise, and then funnily enough, about maybe a month later, details on the XZ Utils compromise happened. And some of what we established here was helpful in order to really make sure that the community was able to work together to understand the full extent of that and make sure that couldn't happen again. And then we also worked to, strengthen the broader infrastructure. One area we identified, right, working with folks like OpenSF, was that really underappreciated aspect of the open source ecosystem was the infrastructure that supports open source software, right? So looking at especially package repositories where developers go to get their open source code. And many of these, right, are resource constrained nonprofits that, their infrastructure itself might be closed source, but still super essential. And we've seen, attacks on these platforms, especially, targeting packages hosted on them. So together with OpenSF, we put out some guidance on securing package repositories that document the principles for package repository security is out there. And I understand there's a upcoming OpenSF report that looks into a lot of the impact that's had. So great to see a couple of years later now, a lot of the results that are coming out of that. And down the line, I would love to see things like additional funding to help strengthen these ecosystems. I know the German government has done a lot through their sovereign tech fund to help secure these platforms. And I think much more of this is needed. So those were a number of actions that we took at CISA. We also put out a request for information with the White House, looking at open source security and memory safety. Got a lot of good responses there, and really can use that to inform a number of the efforts I discussed here. So there was this, good sustained push around open source security. We also covered, elements around open source AI, thinking about how does this change in the era of AI, right? And I think it's interesting both with the application of AI systems. This was a letter that we put out from CISA in response to the NTIA, the National Telecommunications Information Agency, I believe, Information Administration. And in this, we advocated in favor of open sourcing, not just model weights, but ideally, you have the ability to create a fully reproducible model inclusive of its training data, its source code, and having distinctions there in terms of, whether it's just the way it's being published or whether it's truly open source. And I think especially, now as we look to the kind of race to build the best AI models, and, open source is playing a key role in that, I think this is more important than ever. But I do want to take a moment, right, to think about what the future of open source policy looks like. There's a lot of these efforts I mentioned, and kind of as I said, right, the future is quite uncertain, at least in the US. I do hope that, right, the federal government can recognize that the need to, one, make sure that our agencies are staffed with technical people who are able to work in these communities, right, to continue pushing forward on many of these areas I mentioned, and that we can get policies, things like the Securing Open Source Software Act passed in order to really codify that. Yeah, at the same time, right, I think it is essential to see how the global community can really help to fill some of this. And there's many discussions ongoing in the EU around, as the Cyber Resilience Act gets implemented, and I think that's a great way to participate in those processes, help make sure that the standards resulting out of that are sensible, and continue to have a voice in that. And it remains to be seen what this looks like in the US. But the more we can do to make sure that the government has a position of showing up, of contributing, and right, not controlling or regulating, but really being a community member, the better, in my opinion. One kind of final, I know we have a couple minutes left, want to leave room for questions. I do want to think about what the future of open source security looks like in the age of AI, right? Not just from the perspective of open source AI, but also from the perspective of the fact that more and more AI will be used to write open source code, right? And we can reasonably expect there to be more open source code likely, put out in the next year or two than has ever been written before. And what does that look like from a security perspective, right? There's a Backbench, a benchmark out there looking at how well LLMs do at generating secure code. Even the best models introduce vulnerabilities quite a large proportion of the time. And this, I think, goes in line with many of the kind of conversations, efforts right around educating developers around security. We need to make sure that as we put out all of this open source code, much of which is AI generated, that is being built with security from the start, right? So really, that's where I think the extension of much of what we are working on with Secure by Design at CISA comes in, is making sure that software written by AI is secure by design. The good news, in my opinion, right, is that's the same set of kind of security controls, guardrails that we've known about, right? Memory safe languages, other actions to prevent entire classes of vulnerabilities. Those dynamics don't change. It's just about making sure that that's actually getting enforced as more code is being written than ever before. So with that, I want to open up for questions, but thank you everyone for coming. Yeah.
So with KubeCon being around the door, how do you view the interaction with this work and open source in general, specifically with the efforts that are going on in Kubernetes?
Are there any specific efforts you're referring to?
So, not specifically, but do you have a view on what's going on with the world of Kubernetes specifically?
So I would say I'm not, super actively involved in Kubernetes specifically. I will say, right, that I think a lot of these underlying dynamics are at place across the board, right, where AI is fundamentally changing how we're building software, and that there's often, right, the kind of central infrastructure that is core to the security. So I think that, especially as we're thinking about, some of the recent supply chain attacks, for instance, and compromises that have occurred there, we need to be thinking about both what can be done at the kind of individual package level, right? How we can make sure that consumers of open source software are doing a better job around scrutinizing their dependencies, things like that, but then also looking at, what can be done at the overall kind of system or repository level, whether that's open source repositories, right? Talk about some of the kind of principles for package repository security, but similarly, right, for if you're distributing images, things like that, and what security controls might be in place there.
Yeah. You made this. made this great comment about AI is doing more of our software development right now. Does it feel like we're a little timid to make requirements on how AI is generating code in your mind, or do you feel like we're kind of letting it go its own way?
So I do think that that is right, really the direction. Part of what I think is exciting, right, about this new era of AI code generation is that for the first time, we don't actually have to rely on an individual developer, right, knowing all of the security practices they need to follow in order to write secure code, right? At the same time, the state of the art with an AI model on its own isn't all that great. So I do think that that means, right, we have to give the AI information around, right, how to write more secure code for a given environment. Often that's very contextual, right? A lot of what we're working on at Corridor is that exact problem around kind of how can we help make sure that an AI model does have the context it needs in an environment to write more secure code. But for me, right, that this is I think exciting development, right, because that there's obviously a lot of potential for risk, but I do see a path for us to make sure that that code is more kind of consistently secure by default as well. Okay, maybe one more question, yeah? Interesting. I haven't seen that exact one. Was that, or yeah, which one was this? Okay. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting dynamics, right? Where clearly in this point area, when you discover a vulnerability, you should ideally make a patch as well. There's been some interesting discussion with Google, and they have a couple projects to identify vulnerabilities in open source code, right? Called Big Sleep. They had one interesting vulnerability in FFmpeg, and there was probably saw some, let's say, healthy discussion around kind of what a company's responsibility should look like, right? Where some people felt that Google was finding all these vulnerabilities but not giving sufficient resources to help get them fixed. So I think that's a lot of, right, where the kind of sustainability question comes in as well. Certainly if you're a company like Google, you should ideally dedicate resources to not just identifying vulnerabilities, but fixing them, making those patches available as well. And right, that's where I think we do need to kind of, both build out better kind of norms around this and make sure that they're being followed by companies.